All right, we'll go ahead and get started. Welcome to the quarterly Technical Advisory Committee meeting for the Dinuba Wellfield RIFS project. Couple of things, as in the past, if you have any comments during the meeting, please feel free to make those verbally or type your questions or comments in the chat. And then also, this meeting is recorded. So if any of our TAC members aren't able to be here, or for the instance, the one I missed inviting, then we can provide that recording to them or to you guys. And with that, I will turn it over to Sarah and we'll go ahead and get started.
Welcome, everyone. I'm going to just do a little roll call here. I think we have Alex Huang. Yes. Rob. Okay, great. And Robin.
Yep.
And Paul.
I'm here.
And Kristen.
Hello.
Hello. And Ishmael.
I'm here.
Okay. Mike Titsa.
Present.
And Nick Anchor. Hello. Steve Spencer.
Howdy.
And Kelly McInerney. Great. Okay. Well, welcome to the last Technical Advisory Committee of this project. It's the exciting conclusion to almost 2 years worth of hard work. If you want to go to the next slide, I will discuss the disclosure that you all know about. This is funded by Prop 1, and the contents of this presentation do not necessarily reflect the views and policies of the foregoing, nor does mention of trade names or commercial product constitute endorsement or recommendations for use. Okay, let's get to the agenda. All right, we're going to initially talk about the schedule and the upcoming milestones for the project. Then we'll go right into the feasibility study approach. We'll talk about the technology alternatives and screening, the implementation project alternatives, and the evaluation and ranking of those alternatives, the preferred project, and then we'll have questions and general commentary. All right, this should be familiar. You have all received the draft RI report. We submitted to you last month, and thank you, Robin, for your comments, and thank you, Paul, for your acknowledgement of the report. We really appreciate it. We will incorporate your comments. Robin, I think I might send out a reminder to folks that we would appreciate their comments now if they haven't had a chance to look at them. I'm wondering, Kristen, do you have any comments or will you be commenting on this?
I don't have any comments at this time, but I'll make sure to let Brian know, my district engineer, if he has any of that to get them to me ASAP.
Thank you. And Chad, did you get a chance to look at the RI report? Not sure that he's here. Okay. Okay, and then the groundwater modeling technical memorandum also went out a week later. Any preliminary comments, or has anyone had a chance to look at that technical memorandum?
Sarah, we've had a chance to look at them. The state has, and I was planning on sending out my comments later this week. Actually, I sort of did them in tandem with the draft RI report. So hopefully I'll have those out to you pretty soon.
Okay, great. I'm going to talk about the draft FS report. We're working on it right now, and Steve and Kelly and the team we're trying to get it out next week or so, but definitely with enough time for a 30-day review so that we can finalize it by the end of January. Any questions about those reports, Robin or Alex?
No, I'm just glad to hear that you're chugging away on it, and we'll be seeing it soon because that work completion date is starting to come up pretty quick.
It's pretty serious, I know. And then also just a comment that last time we all met, we talked about our request for a schedule extension, and that was approved. So the official final date of the project is February 28th, 2022. So done. And then Robin or Alex, can you give me an update on the grant program round 3 grant applications?
Sure, I can give you an update on that. We recently hired a new supervisor. So my boss, previously Megan had been the supervisor, and she stepped down, or she promoted to a different position in August. I think taking effect in September. So we've kind of been a bit slow over the past few weeks in reviewing the round 3 proposals, but now that we have a complete management chain again, you can probably expect to hear something in early 2022. So we're behind by maybe a month or so.
Okay. Okay, now Mike, I will hand it over to you if you want to get to that next slide.
Okay. Yeah, so I'm just going to give you an overview of the feasibility study approach. This is more or less just a reminder since it's been a little while since we've met. Next slide. So just in general, the way the project works, it started with data compilation and collection and to feed a remedial investigation that provides the data inputs into a groundwater model and an engineering evaluation. And then to that we add screening criteria, and we use the information and the screening criteria to screen various different alternatives for implementation projects, and to rank and refine the preferred implementation project. Next slide. So this gives a little bit more information about the feasibility study process. We start at a high level by screening different possible technology alternatives. And technologies, in this case, the term is used kind of loosely. It can include things like engineering controls or pumping schedules or installing wells, installing recharge, and so forth. So we identify all of the different potentially applicable alternatives. We develop threshold screening criteria. So those are pass-fail screening criteria. And then whatever alternatives fail or whatever technologies fail, we screen them out from further consideration. And then for the ones that we don't screen out, we carry them forward to the next step to identify and analyze implementation project alternatives. So we basically build and group our alternatives from the passing technologies. So we assemble them. Then we evaluate their performance using the model. We develop feasibility evaluation criteria, and we evaluate and rank the alternatives in accordance with those criteria. And when I say evaluate performance, it's performance relative to the grant program objectives of cleaning up or preventing contamination from spreading, and specifically in this case, of course, nitrate, TCP, and DBCP. And then based on the evaluation and ranking, we identify a preferred project. And then that preferred project, we prepare a conceptual design and prepare a cost estimate. And that's that whole process is what we're presenting in the coming up slides. And then this is an overview of the table of contents of the feasibility study report that you'll see. And it'll provide the introduction and background, basically the context of what we're doing and the remedial investigation background and the objectives. We'll talk about the approach and the results of screening the technologies. There's a section devoted to assembling and describing the different implementation project alternatives and how we've defined them for modeling. And then the groundwater flow and solute transport modeling results to look at the effect or performance of those alternatives. And then the alternative evaluation and ranking, and then describing the preferred project. And with that, I'll turn it over to Steve.
Great, thanks, Mike. So we'll talk briefly about the technologies that we investigated and some of the screening criteria that we used. So if we advance to the next slide. As Mike said, the threshold screening criteria are kind of pass-fail. So we examined these four: regulatory compliance, community acceptance, implementability, meaning whether the project I need to build the project or operate the project, and then risk and uncertainty. Those are two sort of different things, but we lump them together. An uncertain project may be low risk, but may have little hope of being implemented. A high risk project maybe be the opposite, but together they kind of manage one of our criteria. So in each case, when we looked at various alternatives for improving groundwater beneath Dinuba, we looked at whether they met all four of these criteria. And then if they did, then they would potentially be passed along to build scenarios for basically treatment alternative scenarios. So here's a quick summary of which technologies passed and which ones did not, and the reasons for those. We can get into some of the details if you'd like, but in general, no action, in situ treatment, pump and discharge to the wastewater treatment plant, or the city of Dinuba's wastewater plant, pump and discharge to AID canals, and aquifer storage and recovery were all failed one or more of the criteria. So we moved along the technologies: ex situ treatment, meaning pumping, and the treatment in this case is going to be land application. There's also an ex situ treatment, pumping, and treatment. We examined wellhead treatment for TCP, which is one of the chemicals of concern, constituents of concern beneath Dinuba. Well modification. The wellhead treatment falls under well modification. There you can see administrative controls and a managed aquifer recharge. So those on the left that passed then were used to build our project alternatives. So at this point, I just briefly pause if there's any questions before we move on and describe the alternatives that we selected and the scenarios that we ran through the model, the groundwater model, to come up to basically help us rank which alternatives became the preferred project. So any questions in particular on the tech screening?
Steve, yeah, I did have just one question about what exactly is meant by in situ treatment there on the fail side. Just briefly describe, what would have been that particular project.
Sure. In this case, since the constituents of concern are nitrates and then AgChem, TCP, and DBCP. So nitrates can be treated in a biological setting, a anoxic setting, like it happens at a wastewater treatment plant. So potentially you could inject the right kind of bacteria in an anoxic zone in the soil. And this is all theoretical. I don't know if anybody's ever tried it because there's a lot of risks involved. It's unlikely to be accepted by either the regulating agencies or the community. And it would be difficult to implement on a citywide basis. That's essentially, that's why these things get screened out at this level, right?
I see, yeah.
There's not really an in situ treatment for DBCP or TCP that I'm aware of, based on the very low concentrations and widespread impacts throughout the city. So again, that gets rejected in the screening process.
Yeah, if I could just chime in, it's one thing, in terms of, like in situ redox solutions, you might see them applied for hazardous waste sites that are very well understood and controlled, and where there's very little risk of or where there's less risk of unintended consequences. I mean, there's risk of unintended consequences there too, but if you do it in a municipal well field, it's quite a different matter. And so we looked at that and we thought, well, theoretically it's possible, but it would just be super high risk, and we just didn't see any way that either a regulatory agency or the public would ever want to undertake that.
That makes sense. Okay, well, thank you for explaining. I just was curious.
Sure, you bet. Okay, so at this point, unless there's any more questions, I'll ask Kelly to describe the scenarios that we built around the technologies that pass the screening.
All right, so in this section, I'm going to be going over the project alternatives that we built based on the technological approaches that Steve just discussed. We obviously only considered the 4 approaches that we considered passing. So we were able to put together 6 scenarios. I'm just going to kind of briefly touch on each of these scenarios on this slide, because I'm going to be going into depth into each project in the following slides. So in scenario 1, we had a GSP project, which utilized managed aquifer recharge. And then in scenario 2, we were looking at removing DBCP and TCP from groundwater by maximizing pumping at well 14. So that relied on, it included well modification as well as administrative controls. And then in scenario 3, we were looking at constructing a new well in place of the current RCR well, which also included well modifications and administrative controls. And then in scenario 4, we were looking at shallow groundwater pumping where there was water with high nitrate, and then that water would be applied as irrigation water. So in that scenario, we also were using ex situ treatment as well as administrative controls. And then in scenario 5, we will be utilizing the current well 14 basins to recharge water from AID. So in that scenario, the technology that would be used would be managed aquifer recharge. And then in scenario 6, we looked at increasing the current stormwater retention basin capacity based on the AECOM tech memo that was put together. And that scenario has a little bit of aquifer recharge involved as well. All right, so before I go into each of these projects in detail, I just kind of want to clear up some of the verbiage that we'll be using. So we refer to the groundwater in terms of the shallow zone, the upper deep zone, and the lower deep zone. So as you can see in this graphic here, the shallow zone is the upper 230 feet, then the upper deep is from 230 feet deep to 400 feet deep, and the lower deep would be anything beyond 400 feet. All right, so our first project that we put together, we refer to all of these projects as scenarios. So scenario 1 is the GSP project, in which this was outlined in the Groundwater Sustainability Plan that was adopted in 2019 by the Kings River East GSA. So in that Groundwater Sustainability Plan, they called for recharge in the northwest section of town. There wasn't a specific area, so we found an area that we thought was most appropriate within the city limits, and we identified 60 acres of current farmland, and that those basins in that 60 acres would be infiltrating water from the Smithtown ditch, which you can barely see on this figure, but it's in that very, very upper right corner of the figure. So one issue here is that this isn't land that the city owns. It would have to be acquired. But all of the numbers that we have here are coming from the GSP in that proposed project. All right, so, and if there's any questions on any of these scenarios, feel free to ask them now before we move on to the next one. All right, so I'll go into scenario 2, which is administrative controls for 123 TCP mitigation. So currently, well 14 has GAC treatment for the TCP in that area. So we've proposed in this scenario to maximize pumping since there's already treatment currently in place at that well. So we would be increasing the pumping from 597 million gallons per year up to 735 million gallons per year. So by increasing the pumping at well 14, we would be decreasing the pumping at the surrounding wells, and the two wells closest to well 14 are shown here, and that would be well 16 and well 20. So the volumes that those wells would be producing each year would be reduced since well 14 would then be producing more. And this would just help to draw out that TCP laden water in that area and hopefully prevent it from spreading to other areas and contaminating other wells. Also, as part of this scenario, we've proposed, so well 21 is a well that the city will be installing in the future. They're currently in the works for putting it in. And there has been some TCP in that northwest section, like north of the city there. So there is the potential that they could encounter TCP at that well. So in this scenario, we've proposed installing, oh, sorry, could you go back? So we proposed installing, in addition to well 21, which would be producing 402 million gallons annually, we've proposed installing 2 wells. So one would be in the deep zone, and then one would be in the upper deep zone. And then they would split the production between the 2 wells. And this would help to balance the drawdown of water and hopefully mitigate the transfer of TCP in that area. All right, are there any questions on this project? All right, let's move on to scenario 3.
Just one quick question. Those 2 wells, what year exactly are they planned to be installed?
So well 21 is already in progress. They've already done all the work. It's going to be installed like within the next year or 2, right?
I think so. Ismail may be better positioned to.
Yeah. Well 21 will be constructed next late summer to fall. Depends on. It's in design right now. The design isn't the issue, but there's $1 million that has been allocated by our senator, and so the funding for that is it gets approved in June, and so whenever they say okay, you can start spending money, we'll start. So sometime late fall or September or summer. I'm sorry, late summer or fall. Thank you.
Gotcha.
And then I'll just address the well 22 and 23 there at the bottom. Those haven't been included in our, they won't be included in the project just because those have a 5 and 10 year horizon respectively. So those wouldn't qualify for the grant.
They were simulated, but they wouldn't be, part of the project as it's defined for the grant.
Right. Of course.
Sorry.
All right.
Scenario 3.
Yeah. So in scenario 3, we are looking at the RCR well, which is currently located near the golf course and near the wastewater reclamation plant. currently the wastewater reclamation plant is infiltrating all of its treated water. So there's a large volume of clean water or treated water that's being infiltrated, and that water is very low in nitrates, like Steve said, due to the anoxic bacteria in the plant. But that large volume of water is pushing the higher nitrate laden water down to lower depths. Typically the water with high nitrate is shallow, but with the large volume of water, we're seeing that high nitrate water be pushed down into the deeper zones. So the RCR well was initially installed to draw nitrate laden water to be used as irrigation for the golf course. However, that well is currently producing clean water that doesn't have any nitrates because it's capturing water from the infiltration at the wastewater reclamation plant. So in this project, we've proposed abandoning the current RCR well and installing a new deep zone well where the current RCR well is, and that well would serve as irrigation for the golf course like the current RCR well is now, in addition to a 58-acre park that's going to be installed there near the golf course. So this would help because we would be removing water with high nitrates from the groundwater, and then by applying it as irrigation water, it would allow the turf to uptake that nitrate as fertilizer.
So then in this particular project, or this alternative, that would entail the abandonment of the RCR well and then the construction and drilling of a new RCR well.
Yeah, that's correct.
Deeper. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, all right. Scenario 4. So in scenario 4, we identified 4 different areas where there is the opportunity to irrigate turf. So this included parks and schools and also the future proposed high school. So in this scenario, we would be installing shallow groundwater wells at each of those parks. So this would remove water in the shallow zone that has high nitrates, and then it would be applied to the lawns and turf fields for irrigation, which would again allow the turf to uptake the nitrates and infiltrate the clean water back into the groundwater. However, the volumes of water that are needed to irrigate these parks and fields that we identified is quite low. So that was something that we saw impact the outcome later on. Are there any questions here? All right, so I'll move on to scenario 5. So in scenario 5, we would be utilizing the current basins at well 14. There's 3 basins, and they have a total acreage of 30 acres. And we're also proposing adding a new 10-acre basin on city land right there, just north and northwest of the current basins. So in this scenario, we would be getting water from AID from the Dinuba town ditch. And this water would be supplied in years with above average rainfall. And then that water would be infiltrated at these 4 basins. In addition to infiltration at these basins, we would also be installing 2 400-foot deep wells for future development. And each of those 2 wells there to the south would be producing 400 acre feet a year. And that's for the city's future expansion plans. So the basins and the water that they would be getting from AID would not be consistent every year. It would depend on years where there is storm water available.
Let me just add, Kelly, a couple of things. One is that We'd also be diverting some, or not diverting, but collecting stormwater runoff from the city's stormwater system in those basins. And that's estimated to be on average 340, no, that's still this one, 340 acre feet per year on average, but it would happen every year to some extent, whereas the AID deliveries on average would only happen once every 4.5 years. And then the reason for the down gradient wells that Kelly mentioned, those are completed in the upper deep zone, and those would be used to supply a proposed non-potable water system that would be developed in the future in that southwest part of town. And then also the city's municipal expansion well field, the wells 22 and 23 would be installed further down gradient than that in an area where they could benefit from the cleaner water recharge and protection that's being afforded by the clean water recharge at the well 14 ponds.
All right, so in scenario 6, we looked at the AECOM technical memo, which outlined the drainage basin capacity analysis for the city of Dinuba. And this identified, it went through all of the city's drainage basins and identified which ones had the capacity for expansion. So we identified 8 basins that we would be interested in expanding, and with the expansion of those 8 basins, we would add an additional 457 acre feet of storage capacity. And right now, the city currently pumps water from their stormwater retention basins out into AID and other drainage facilities. So that water isn't able to be infiltrated or stored at all because there isn't currently capacity for it when there are storm events. So by expanding it, we would be able to reserve that water instead of sending it out of the city, and also use it for infiltration. However, we don't have any data on how much water the city is currently pumping out of these basins, and there's so little data on the amount of water that's currently going into each of these basins that we felt like it wasn't appropriate to continue with this project because of the lack of information. So once we got to this point, we had to discard this scenario, so you won't see this scenario in the remainder of the steps as we move forward in this process of evaluating them. All right, and if there's no questions, then I'll hand it over to Steve.
Great, thanks. Okay, so now I'll just cover the ranking of the scenarios. As Kelly said, we're only ranking the first 5. Scenario 6 was excluded because it's just impossible to know what benefit it may have. So the feasibility evaluation criteria and scoring are these 5 categories that we used. For various reasons, they were weighted. Some of them were weighted more heavily. Effectiveness, of course, and cost and risk and uncertainty are given a higher weighting than the last 2. And each, the scoring was done on a comparative basis, so a qualitative basis. Each scenario was ranked 1 through 5, depending on 5 being the best and 1 being the worst in each of these 5 categories. And then the weighting factor was applied, and then the scoring came out at the end. So I'll just cover, if you can go to the next slide. So this there's a lot of numbers here, so we're not going to get into it too deep here, but basically the modeling was used, once we established the scenarios, the groundwater model was used to estimate the effectiveness of each of the scenarios, and that was derived by how much water was either prevented from exceeding the MCL or lowered below the MCL. As you can see, the scenarios, the most effective scenarios, just based on order of magnitude, were the two managed aquifer recharge projects, 5 and 1 and 5. Scenario number 2 had some benefit. Scenario number 3, the RCR well replacement, had some benefit. Scenario number 4, the shallow pumping for irrigation, just didn't show enough benefit in the modeling to go over the threshold that we could say definitively had an impact. So it essentially showed no effectiveness. It just didn't pump enough water overall to really make a difference. So that kind of gives you a rundown of the sort of overall effectiveness in a volume standpoint for each of the scenarios.
Steve, if I could just chime in here, this particular one, actually, we did run this compared to the MCL. You know, how much water was either prevented from exceeding the MCL or brought down below the MCL that was currently above. But this particular slide it's a little bit more nuanced. It's simulative capacity. So and in the nitrate control program, that's defined as the amount of freeboard that you have between the current nitrate concentration and the MCL. So where we were able to improve how far below the MCL the concentration was by more than 20%, that's the volume that this is referring to. And you can see it, you know, divided up into the shallow zone, upper deep zone, lower deep zone over time after 20 and 50 years. But if you look at what was actually cleaned up below the MCL or prevented from going over the MCL, there's a bigger difference between scenarios 1 and 5. You know, that's not teased out here in this particular table. But the scenario 1 was more effective relative to cleaning up water below the MCL. It's just, you know, this already has a lot of numbers in it, so this is the one we chose to present.
Thanks, Mike. Yeah, and if there's any questions about the model or model results, then Mike will be your man in answering that, because we're just taking the results and looking at them sort of from the entire package here. On the next slide shows some of the model output. So from the numbers we go to a little bit more graphical, maybe a little bit easier to understand. So scenario 1 had, these are basically the shallow zone and the upper deep zone changes to nitrate concentrations over 20 and 50 years. And as you can see, the improved water flows basically in the traditional or the typical gradient beneath the city, which is to the southwest, and moves through the city, drawn also by the pumping of existing wells, and shows a pretty significant improvement in the shallow zone where the water is infiltrating, and then in the upper deep zone, not much. There's no figures here for the lower deep zone because the water doesn't have much of a registered impact in the model at that depth, which is understandable considering we're recharging from the surface. I'll note we don't have model results, or we do have model results, but we don't have figures here for TCP and DBCP. Those constituents of concern are just, there's so little above the MCL beneath the city, and not enough data to really demonstrate whether the scenarios are greatly impacting the water quality based on TCP concentrations. So I'm sure if you like, Mike and his team can give you the model outputs that we saw there, but there just isn't enough data, not enough, not much widespread contaminant to look at. So we're basically focusing strictly on nitrates here.
Yeah, I would just say that nitrate was the most obvious benefit. and probably the greatest benefit. And we did see in the modeling some benefit relative to DBCP and TCP, but it was not as clear and not as pronounced. So I mean, there was definitely some benefit there for those two constituents, but the most clear benefit and the most clear need for a benefit that we saw in the city was relative to nitrate in the shallow and upper deep zone.
So scenario 2, which is scenario 2. This is a view of the impact on nitrate. Scenario 2 generally was intended to get after TCP in the shallow aquifer and in the upper deep aquifer. Nitrate impact here is kind of a stand-in, and it did show some impact on nitrate concentrations. It would probably have an impact on TCP, considering well 14 is impacted currently with TCP, and if we pump more water, we remove more mass. There's just not enough data to make a definitive statement on that. Scenario 3 is our replacement of the RCR well, and that does have an improvement on nitrate concentrations primarily in the upper deep zone over time. Again, we're not pumping a lot of water relative to the entire city of Dinuba, so it shows up in a fairly limited way, but in the location there, it is effective.
Steve, I would just add that for this particular one, the 50-year cleanup plume, if you will, for the lower deep zone is actually a little bit bigger than it is for the upper deep zone. So there was some benefit in the lower deep zone for this particular scenario as well.
Right. So yeah, if anybody wanted to have a look at those results, Mike and his folks have those outputs. Scenario 4, we're not, as I mentioned, it didn't register enough of an impact to show up in the model, at least to any degree that you could hang your hat on. So we're skipping that here and moving to scenario 5. Scenario 5 is a recharge at the existing managed aquifer recharge at the existing well 14 basins, and it shows, especially in the shallow aquifer, a pretty good impact south of the city. And my understanding is that area of the city may be incorporated in the city in the future. So the wells that are pumping from down there would see the benefit of the recharge at the well 14 basins. So any questions on the model outputs before I move to the scoring?
Well, I noticed on the side here for scenario 5, there were 2 different versions for scenario 5. There was, I think, a 1,000 acre feet, and then there was a lesser amount.
Yeah, this is the 1,000 acre foot version. The 600 acre foot version was similar but smaller.
I see. So yeah, so you're just showcasing the larger effect here.
Right. That's basically what we're doing. I mean, we figured that at this point you've probably seen enough ink blots, but both will be shown in the FS. So the I'd say, this, if you were to compare, for example, scenario 1 next to this one, you'd see scenario 1 has a bigger effect and darker blue, a bigger reduction. And then the next one is this 1,000 one, kind of the same order of magnitude, but less. And then 600, again, same order of magnitude, but the area is smaller and the amount of reduction is slightly less.
I see. I just wondered whether or not you had produced those figures as well. So it sounds like you have.
Yeah. And we actually have figures. Did we produce figures for TCP and DBCP? Okay. So we'll have figures for DBCP and TCP in the appendices as well. So you'll be able to see all of those. But The nitrate impacts by far turned out to be the most important benefit.
Perfect. Yeah.
Great. So the next slide has the score, the ranking and scoring. So, and these are listed by the weighted score. So I'll just cover the top couple. There is scenario 3, the RCR replacement well scored the highest by a fraction, followed by the well 14 basins, managed aquifer recharge at the well 14 basins, and then down from there. I can go to the next slide. So ranking wise, scenario 3 is ranked high because of it's a low cost, it's a low risk, and it provides a benefit. The benefit is limited, but the cost and risk factors are in the ranking make a difference, and that's why it's scored at the top. Scenario 5, which is ranked second, is probably, as far as performance and effectiveness goes, second best. It does have some uncertainty, especially with the amount of water that will be received and how frequently we'll receive that water from AID. So that's the biggest risk. There is a cost associated with that, somewhat significant cost, especially with the addition of wells, downgrading it for irrigation purposes. So we'll show you in a little bit some of the costs there. Scenario 1 ranks third, and primarily, even though that has the best overall performance, primarily it ranks third because the city doesn't own the land. The chances of implementing that scenario under the current funding deadlines are very low, and the GSP assumes more water than maybe is actually available when we start talking to the AID and about how much water might be possible. So if the water was available and we could begin building right away, it's possible that scenario 1 might be the highest rank, but both of those risks really pull the ranking down. The other two scenarios, kind of as we discussed, scenario 2 and scenario 4 rank pretty low, mostly because of the limited impacts that they provide for the groundwater.
I would just add, Steve, that I guess I look at scenario 1 kind of like as an honorable mention. We simulated it because it's the GSP project, so we want to say, well, what about this project? And the benefits are obvious if it can be pulled off. But the challenge is that it's based on an assumption of 5,200 acre feet being delivered on average every 3 years. And the first thing that we found was that additional information that AID had available was that, water, stormwater discharge in the Kings River is likely to be available about once every 4.5 years, not once every 3 years. And then if you're talking about implementing 5,200 acre feet of diversion and infiltration, and you need to do it relatively quickly because you don't necessarily have a good way to store that water in the long term while you trickle it into your recharge basins. You'd need a lot of land. And so there's a good deal of uncertainty, but the benefit is obvious. It's in the GSP. And so, I don't think anyone wants to walk away from it. I think it kind of gets honorable mention, whereas scenario 5 is kind of the same concept, but better thought out. We've looked at and we've discussed with AID what the delivery challenges would be. We're planning to investigate the infiltration challenges. And between the 600 acre foot per year and 1,000 acre foot per year scenario, we think we bracketed what's reasonably possible. So yeah, so we'll be talking a little bit further about that.
So moving on to the next slide, we'll cover the preferred project. So based on the rankings and kind of balancing effectiveness, cost, and risk, we believe the preferred project is a combination of scenario 5 and scenario 3. The scenario 5 gives us the biggest potential bang for a reasonable risk and uncertainty, where scenario 3 is effective and at a very low cost relative to what the potential benefit is. And so the two together, if you can go to the next slide, would essentially look like this. And you've pretty much seen these. I mean, there's not a lot of surprise here. These two figures show the overall site plan with the improvements to the basin, the well 14 basins, and the new RCR well. If you go to the next slide, it gives you a little bit better focus. So here are the existing basins. To make this project work, besides the new wells that we're just talking about, we're talking about installing a pipeline, as Kelly discussed earlier, to bring additional water, stormwater from the Centennial Park Basin, which currently is discharged to one of the AID drainages. We'd go ahead and capture that and recharge it. We would basically repair the easternmost basin. You can see it has evidence that it has water in it. That basin is currently used for stormwater. It needs some repair after looking at it. The next two basins are only shallow overflow basins right now for stormwater. For recharge, they need to be deepened. So we're talking about taking them down to 13 or 14 feet below grade and improving the facilities to allow water to more easily move between one basin and the next for balance. And then we'd be expanding the westernmost basin with the additional land available from the city. The spoil would be from the basins would be disposed. Thank you, Kelly. My brain freaked out. Okay, on city land just to the south there, so it wouldn't need to be trucked off. And then we would install two wells, as we mentioned earlier, down gradient for a non-potable supply when the city is ready to deliver water for irrigation purposes, purple pipe, that sort of thing. So the combination there with water we could get from AID would average somewhere between 600 and 1,000 acre feet per year, which Mike mentioned. And then on this slide, obviously the RCR replacement well isn't shown. It was shown on the previous slide, but the major work would be done here on city property near well 14. Any questions about the preferred project before I get into some of the other like design considerations?
Well, I'm curious whether or not you've essentially gone through a scenario using the groundwater model where both of these scenarios were implemented at the same time. You know, what would that end up looking like 20 and 50 years down the line?
Mike, I don't know if we ran that scenario because they're pretty separate.
You mean the scenario 3 and scenario 5?
Yeah.
No, we did run the RCR well together with the with scenario 5 with the well 14 ponds, and in fact, if you go back to the plume map, you'll see some improvement in the. So keep going up a little bit more, Trilby. There, one more. Oh, one back down. Okay, so One down.
For scenario 3 or scenario?
No, go to scenario 5.
Scenario 5, yeah, the next one.
So you'll see a little cleanup plume coming down gradient from the RCR well there. That's the RCR well is actually turned on and deepened in that particular run.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, I see. So this figure captures, these figures captures both of those.
Exactly. Yes. Yes. And it does look like that, especially after 50 years in the upper deep zone, that the combination of the two projects together makes a bigger difference than just the well 14 ponds by themselves.
All right, good. Yeah, I'd forgotten that we had that in there, Mike. Thanks for pointing that out. So if we go back to the preferred project design assumptions. There we go. So we've kind of here identified 5A and 5B. Basically, it's the bracketing, the amount of water we think we could not only receive from AID but also infiltrate in the available number of days. If the water comes down the mountain in a limited time frame, we have to be able to get it in the ground when it's available, since it's not stored anywhere. So you can see the number of days and the amount of infiltration rate that's being assumed. The half a foot per day infiltration rate on one hand, and then 1 foot per day infiltration rate. We think we can achieve somewhere between those two with proper maintenance on the ponds on a regular basis. And that would mean probably an annual maintenance to make sure we are ready for when the storm events do come, because when they do come, we'll need to take as much water as we can get. The flow in the AID water delivery flows is more for AID's benefit, to let them know, because we may also be limited by how much carry capacity are in the canals. And a lot of these details we've discussed with AID, but there's probably more details to work out. It just gives you a general idea of kind of the scale, the magnitude that would be required to deliver that water. So here we have the cost estimate. Yeah, go ahead and go to the next slide. It's fine. The last slide for me here is the preferred project cost estimate in today's dollars. We've got the earthwork at the various basins, including the new basin expansion. And again, based on the assumptions that we can dispose of the soil there on city property right adjacent to the existing basins. The new wells, that would include the RCR well, so there's 3 wells. And we've separated out the well itself from the well site construction, because they tend to be built by different contractors, so it's easier for us to think about it that way. And the overall project in total is about, with the contingency built in, based on this level of estimate, about $6.5 million. So I think that's it for us. And if there's any questions, be happy to address them.
I think this is Sarah. I'll open up to Ishmael if you wanted to make any comments on this project.
The only comments I have is that I didn't hear it mentioned, but right now with those, well, actually Steve did briefly, the basins around well 14, when we built those, they were supposed to be for groundwater recharge, but because they're not deep enough, really, it's just a temporary holding basins, and then we have to move the water back down into the AID's canals and down the road. So just deepening those, even if we remain in a drought for the next 10 years and don't get a whole lot of stormwater from upstream, the water that we get in our downtown, we just installed a 60-inch, 60, that's how much stormwater we get in our downtown. And we installed a 60-inch line going all the way down there, and So just by deepening the wells, we at least capture that stormwater, and it's an enormous amount. We used to flood all around our high school. So yeah, so that project does a lot more than it captures a lot more water than just what AID is bringing from upstream. And other than that, man, this project has been going on for a while, and a lot of work, a lot of data, a lot of meetings, a lot of discussions, and very happy with the way it's turned out. So, want to thank Mike and Sarah and Steve and his team and Trilby and everybody else involved, and also, of course, Robin and Paul and those of you at the state that are helping us out with this. Just excited about it and excited to see it wrapping up and have some projects to implement now.
Yeah, one thing that we didn't really expand on very much, because the focus of this was the nitrate, DBCP, and TCP, is that the other benefits of the recharge basin is that they set off or they offset a substantial fraction of the city's expected demand increase over time. We'd like to be able to offset more, but I think in the near term, being able to make a dent in that that also benefits water quality, I think, is really what we were targeting. With the basin looking for opportunities for additional recharge. So just thought I would mention that.
And I think we all know this is a lot of information that we're throwing at you, so I would assume most of the questions will come after you have a chance to digest it a little bit. So I would expect that's how I would handle it. Let me think about it.
Any comments, Robin or Alex?
Oh, well, it seems like the feasibility study is coming together pretty well. Do you have a predicted time to submit a draft to the TAC for review, or is that within December?
Yeah, it'll be. I think we're almost done. Yeah.
Yeah, I think like next week.
Next week for sure. We'll punch it out.
Wow. All right.
Yeah, I mean it's basically done. There's some of the things we talked about today, getting ready for this presentation, need to be touched up in there, but overall the information's all there.
Great to hear.
Yeah, is there any we can ask the question a little bit different way. Is there anything in particular, having heard this, that you might find helpful for your review, or any particular information that you're thinking you might really like to see?
Oh, well, one thing that I did notice in the discussion of the feasibility study here and the different scenarios and the different variables that the scenarios were based on, or parameters, I suppose, that did seem, one of them seemed relevant to my review of the groundwater modeling tech memo. And that was in particular the assimilative capacity increase of 20%. That was actually I might as well tell you, that's just briefly, I was going to make a comment on that in the groundwater tech memo, just because it seemed to sort of be floating in the tech memo, and I didn't really have a whole lot of context of where that 20% came from. And so hearing the feasibility study alternatives, that gave me a little bit more background.
Yeah, so what we tried to do there, Robin, was initially we extracted information regarding, because with the different model runs, it's easier to subtract. It's easy to subtract one run from the other and get an aquifer volume, and then using the porosity, a water amount in acre feet, where you've changed your concentration. And so what we started to do was to look at, well, where were we above the MCL before, and how much has that volume changed after 20 years and after 50 years? And that was instructive, but what it missed is that there was benefit in areas that were not above the MCL to start with. So in the FS, we present both. And like I say, I think that the comparison between scenario 1 and scenario 5, is teased out maybe a little bit better if you compare relative to the MCL. But part of that is just a function of location. There was more water above the MCL to be impacted at that upgradient location.
I think I see. So in the process of modeling, over the course of 20 years, then about 20% of that capacity dropped below the MCL.
Well, in this case, the assimilative capacity was improved by, basically, another way of saying improving assimilative capacity by 20% is saying that we've decreased the nitrate concentration by 2 parts per million nitrate nitrogen or more. And so that's the aquifer volume in which the concentration was decreased by 2 ppm or more. And then another threshold that we set that we didn't present here was aquifer volume in which we brought the concentration below the MCL, where it either was above the MCL at the beginning of the simulation or would have been by the end of the simulation without the project, and then we simulated it with the project and we looked at the difference there.
Okay, so then that becomes important in the modeling forecast, in that you basically took that increase into account, so yes, that there was a larger capacity throughout the modeling. Okay.
Right. And then one other thing that we did that we didn't present here was it's pretty easy in the model to post-process nitrate concentration in water that's extracted from various different wells. And so we actually have nitrate concentrations and DBCP concentrations and TCP concentrations over time with and without project implementation for all the wells in the model. And that's pretty instructive. You can see that the recharge projects make a real substantial difference in the contaminant concentrations in the downgradient wells. Whereas the other 3 alternatives that we modeled are kind of not so much. They have a little bit of an effect, but it's more subtle. And the recharge projects make a big dent. The biggest dent in the most wells is with alternative 1, or with scenario 1. But like we pointed out, that one's kind of not ready for prime time yet.
And Mike, those charts are in the tech memo, I believe.
Charts are in the tech memo?
The time series charts?
Well, I know they were for the calibration for the baseline. I don't think they were in there for the predictions.
Oh, okay.
So the ones for the predictions we intended to put as an appendix to the FS.
Got it. Okay. All right. Well, if there aren't any more questions, I'd say we had a very robust last Technical Advisory Committee meeting. So, Trilby, you want to take us home, so to speak?
Absolutely. Thank you all for attending and for participating and providing comments and questions today. And we will be sending out a PDF of the presentation, and then also, as we mentioned, this meeting is recorded, so we'll make sure and get a link of that sent out to everybody, especially for the members who weren't able to be here today. So thank you again.